You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, I have a treat for you. Stephen Wolfe is a contributor to the fabulous Substack publication Downballot. You know Downballot. David Neer, who's the publisher, has been on a bunch of times. And David does a great job, but he doesn't do it alone. Stephen's work is terrific. Stephen, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You are, you've gone down the redistricting rabbit hole. And so I want to talk to you about that. You wrote that Trump-loving gerrymanders, my word, not yours, have succeeded in moving the median House seat from Trump plus 3.1 to Trump plus 4.9, and they could bump their advantage up to over a 9-point advantage. So having said that, first, could you explain to everyone what those numbers mean and how you figured it out?
Yeah, so one way we can measure the Republican advantage with the national congressional map is by looking at the most recent presidential election results in every district, and we can rank those results from Kamala Harris's largest margin to Donald Trump's largest margin and find the median district. And so if we had an unbiased map, we would expect that median district to reflect the national popular vote, which Trump won by 1.5 percentage points. But instead, the map that we have for 2026, thanks to all these new Republican gerrymanders, that median is now just shy of 5 percentage points. So that gives Trump an advantage of about 3.5 percentage points over his popular vote victory. And because of how strongly correlated presidential and congressional election results have been in recent years, we might expect Democrats would need to win the national House vote by a similar margin to take a majority. And G. Elliott Morris over at Strength in Numbers, our friend over at Strength in Numbers, recently wrote a piece finding that Democrats would probably need a 4-point margin nationwide to win the House this fall.
And now, I read that, and he's also been on the show a bunch. But explain that to people, because really, we're really only talking about a handful of districts. I mean, still, most of the districts in the country are not competitive. So we're really talking about, I mean, Democrats can run up their majorities in districts that are safe Democratic districts. It doesn't matter. We need those votes in specific places.
That's right. Because of gerrymandering and also just because of how voters are distributed throughout the country, Democrats win large margins in cities, Republicans tend to win large margins in rural areas. The vast majority of districts are not competitive, and either presidential candidate would have won them by large margins. We can expect that the House race will not see much spending, and that there's not really much chance of the incumbent or the challenger, pulling off an upset. And so both national parties are going to be fighting over, a few dozen seats maybe, and, a fairly small number will be, very close this fall.
And it's in those districts where these gerrymanders might have the most effect.
Well, not necessarily. That's part of it. But in many of these states, and especially in the South, where Republicans have dismantled Voting Rights Act districts, they've taken what were essentially safely Democratic districts and made them safely Republican. And we're talking about, replacing a district that might have been majority Black and gone for Harris by 20 or 30 percentage points, and they've made it heavily white. And now it went for Donald Trump by, 20 or 30 percentage points. So
we're clear, because it didn't go. You can't say it went for because it didn't exist. You're saying if you counted the votes in the new boundary, that's what that looks like.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. If we had had these boundaries in 2024, that's what it would have looked like.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's ugly. And then you've studied this, and you said they could possibly bump it up to over a 9-point advantage, which is insurmountable in any real way. What would they have to do that? Is that by just is that all in the South?
Well, yeah. So Republicans are very likely to pass at least several new maps in 2028. The most likely of which I think are probably in Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and possibly Utah. And then there are several more states beyond that, which they might be able to do as well, but maybe aren't as likely as that first group.
Okay, well, that's all that is terrifying, but you didn't just go down the rabbit hole of what Republicans are doing. The Democratic side, I mean, we saw California join the redistricting battle, but there are there are other possibilities on the Democratic side. Yes, Colorado, New York, maybe Maryland. Just what could Democrats do to even the playing field or bring it closer to even?
Yeah, so we recently published a story looking at 9 states where Democrats may be able to redraw maps by 2028. And if they were able to do all those states, they could target at least 20 Republican-held seats, which would go a very, very long way towards leveling the playing field nationally. And I'll just briefly run down those states. So in Colorado, there is an ongoing ballot initiative effort for this November that if it succeeds, it would implement a 7-to-1 map for 2028 and give Democrats possibly 3 more seats. That still has to qualify for the ballot and win in November. And then in Illinois, Democrats might be able to target at least one of the 3 Republican-held seats. They don't have to make any gains this fall. They already control state government fully. And then you have Maryland, where Democrats could target the one remaining Republican seat. There was an effort to pass a new map this year, and it passed the State House, and the governor supported it. But the state Senate leader, Bill Ferguson, had opposed that effort, ensuring that they would not have a new map in time for this November. But recently, after a lot of pressure from state and national Democrats, Ferguson has said he would be willing to support putting a constitutional amendment on the ballot this fall that would let them redraw the map for 2028. And that effort seems fairly likely to succeed. And then in New Jersey, Democratic state legislative leaders have started talking about putting their own constitutional amendment on the ballot this fall that would let them redraw the map and target probably around 2 of the 3 Republicans left in that state. And then in New York, Democratic legislators just this past week passed the first stage of a constitutional amendment there. They need to pass that same amendment again in 2027, and then it would go to a November 2027 ballot referendum before it could take effect. And if that succeeds, they could target up to 4 Republicans out of the 7 in that state. And then in a few remaining states, in Oregon, there is 1 Republican remaining, and Democrats face a different sort of problem there. Oregon is a rare state where they require a 2/3 supermajority vote in the legislature for a quorum, meaning they need a 2/3 vote for any legislative business. And Republicans have frequently used that requirement to block bills that would otherwise have majority support. Democrats have a chance to win 2/3 supermajorities this fall, although it would be, quite tough to pull that off given the districts that are up. But if they don't, they might be able to compel Republican attendance somehow and pass a new map anyway. And then we have Virginia, where Democrats tried to enact a 10-to-1 map this year, and it passed a voter referendum, but the state Supreme Court ruled that the referendum process had been improper. And otherwise, Democrats wouldn't be able to pass the amendment until 2028. And they have 2 different opportunities for passing the map for next cycle. The first is that one of the Supreme Court justices who was in the majority, the 4-3 majority in that opinion, his seat comes up for election or for selection again in early 2027. And the Democratic legislature could simply pick somebody else and then try to repetition the court to reverse its own ruling. But
Slow down. Supreme Court judges are picked by the legislature in Virginia?
Yes, that's correct.
That's interesting.
Yeah, they're one of just 2 states where they directly pick the justices that way. But if the court for some reason does not reverse itself, Democrats could still pass the amendment again and win another referendum in spring of 2028, just like they did this year. to put the map in place for November of 2028.
Okay, well, so, and if all of that happens, where do we stand?
Well, there are just two more states that are in a lower likelihood of possibility for Democrats, where they actually do need to gain legislative seats this fall. There's Minnesota, where there's a tied state house currently. Neither party has a majority, and if Democrats can flip just one seat and then hold their Senate majority and hold the governor's office, they gain full power there, and they could target at least two of the four Republicans in the state, possibly even a third. And then in Wisconsin, Democrats have a chance to gain legislative majorities for the first time in 16 years, thanks to ungerrymandered legislative maps. And I'm feeling pretty optimistic that they will do that. So if they were to win majorities and hold the governor's office, they could just redraw the Republican favoring 6-2 map that is currently in place, and they could make potentially two or three of those Republican seats much more winnable for Democrats. But the silver lining, even if they don't win the legislature, is that the state Supreme Court has a liberal majority now that is much more inclined toward preventing Republicans from continuing to gerrymander the state. And there are a couple of ongoing lawsuits asking the court to overturn the current map and implement a fairer one. And those cases have a pretty strong likelihood of success by 2028. So if all 9 of those states were to succeed in passing maps and Democrats were to be fairly aggressive in targeting Republicans, what they could do, even if Republicans were able to pass maps in the several more states that we talked about earlier, these Democratic maps could counter them and pull the median districts much further back towards the center, down to just a Trump margin of 1.8 percentage points, which would be a major improvement even over this year and the previous 2024 map.
Okay. So this is all the stuff that hard-nosed political people talk about and think about. It is repulsive for our democracy. And I mean, that with no Voting Rights Act, and apparently, per the Supreme Court in Alabama, no fealty to the 14th Amendment, the maps that are being redrawn in the South don't just change the calculus of politics, but the character of the nation. I mean, does your work talk about that as well?
Yes, absolutely. So we have also looked at all of these states where, after the Supreme Court ruled, where Republicans could target Voting Rights Act districts, and we determined there were about a dozen seats in the South. And Republicans have indeed targeted several of those this year and could target several more next cycle. Overall, this election cycle, Republicans passed maps in 8 new states, including a few outside the South. And in those 8 states, they targeted 16 Democratic-held seats. And of those 16 seats, 11 of them, which is 2/3, were either Voting Rights Act districts where they had a Black or Latino Democratic incumbent, or they were both of those categories. And, as Republicans gerrymander more states, Black and Latino voters are bearing the brunt of that because they tend to have these Voting Rights Act districts, or they tend to be targeting cities like Kansas City and Missouri, where there are large communities of color that ensure Democrats win large majorities if those districts weren't gerrymandered.
Yeah. I want to make this point again, but with reference to Maine, which is in the news, not just because of Graham Plattner's candidacy, but because it's one of 2 states that doesn't award all of its electoral votes in a winner-take-all fashion. And now, of course, they're saying maybe they should if Nebraska does. So it's an issue in the gubernatorial race there right now. Talk a little bit about those 2 states and what's the thinking there.
Yeah, so currently those states are the only ones that assign some of their electoral votes to the winner in each congressional district. And because of that, Harris was able to win an electoral vote in the second district, Nebraska's second district in Omaha, and Trump was able to win one in Maine in the second district in the northern part of the state there. So in the past year, Nebraska Republicans tried to pass a bill to switch to a statewide winner-take-all model that would ensure they would win another electoral vote because it's a very red state. That bill needed a two-thirds supermajority, which Republicans nominally have, but two Republicans refused to go along with that, so the bill failed. However, some other Republicans are attempting to put the legislation on the ballot itself this November, and that has a qualifying deadline of next month, so we will know if that qualifies sometime in the next several weeks. And so in response, Democrats in Maine are talking about switching to winner-take-all as well. And that would only need a simple majority in Maine. It would just be regular legislation. But of course, they would need the governor's sign off on that because Republicans would oppose it. And I think it's fairly likely that if Nebraska does go through with this, Maine will respond in kind. But for Maine, there's a possibility that Republicans in Nebraska could wait so late in the 2028 election year that it is too late for Democrats in Maine to respond. In Maine, legislation does not take effect until 90 days after the legislative session in which it was passed. And there is also a veto referendum process where Republican voters could gather signatures and submit them. And if they had enough, the law would be suspended until a referendum takes place. So Maine would have to act well in advance of the November election that cycle to make sure that the switch to winner take all would take effect.
Yeah. So all of this is about partisans on both sides, and I count myself as one. But it's about partisans talking about how they can effectively disenfranchise the voters in their states whose opinions they don't like.
Yes.
Right. And I'm wondering if you see the beginnings of a backlash that will lead to, I guess we cannot avoid map making, and what Donald Trump and Greg Abbott did by ordering mid-decade redistricting is set off a permanent scuffle so that every single election cycle forever will be on different maps to favor different political parties. And Americans cannot continue to trust the democratic system if that's happening, right? It's a death knell. So I'm wondering if you see a backlash that's going to lead to making maps themselves unimportant. And by that, I mean multi-member districts, proportional representation, the kinds of things that happen in some states and in some municipalities, but it's not yet what we do for congressional seats. Do you see that as possible? And what would be its impact?
Yeah, so I personally would view proportional representation as an essential reform for a variety of reasons, but one of which is that it makes gerrymandering impossible, and the number of seats each party receives will be proportionate to its share of the popular vote. I think we're still a long ways away from that becoming a reality, but this race to the bottom in gerrymandering over the past year has made that more of a possibility than it was in previous years. But I think regardless of the type of reform, there's going to be almost a certainty that Democrats will have to pass some sort of national law to address gerrymandering if they're able to win Congress and the presidency in 2028. And, a whole lot really does depend on that, because if we don't do anything that year, thanks to these gerrymandered maps, Republicans would have a good chance to win back the House in the midterm. And, we could just end up repeating this cycle over and over again with no end in sight. But if Democrats are able to, win full power in 2028 and somehow reform the Supreme Court to prevent it from striking down, a law to end gerrymandering or a law to adopt proportional representation, we could have a much fairer House map in 2030 or 2032 and going forward.
And by the way, let's just be clear. In a in a country that was Trump plus, what did you say, 1.5? What was that
Yes,
number?
that's yeah, 1.5.
If we had a fair vote in that country, and if the congressional vote mirrored the presidential vote, then you know what? There would be a Republican advantage in Congress. These reforms aren't one side cheating the other. They are both sides saying, let's let the voters decide.
Exactly, and that's to me is the beauty of proportional representation. Is you don't even have to have maps. We could just have a statewide vote in each state, and the results would pretty closely reflect the proportion of votes. The seats would fairly closely reflect the proportion of votes each party wins. So it wouldn't really be about advantaging one party or the other, and it would be really about privileging voters because going back to our earlier point, most congressional districts these days and for the past many years have not been competitive. They're very one-sided. But if we have proportional representation, suddenly every voter gets a chance to participate in a competitive election, and candidates and parties would have to be more responsive to a larger pool of voters, on both sides even. We'd have to see Democrats campaigning for votes in, rural areas across the country and in the South and Midwest. And Republicans would be campaigning for voters in, big cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles.
Yes, and you might have other parties too in a system like that. It breaks the two-party duopoly.
Yeah, so that's very highly dependent upon the exact design of the system.
Yep.
If we had, for instance, a statewide vote in California or Texas where there are, close to 40 seats or 50 seats, then it would be very easy for third parties to win seats there. But if we had another type of system like multi-member districts with 3 to 5 members each, and using a ranked choice voting, that would be the barrier would be much higher for third parties, though
Right.
hardly impossible for them to win seats. In fact, I would expect there to be more than 2 parties in just about any proportional system.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. I mean, I think it's important to get Americans used to the idea that we do not have to let politicians draw us out of power when they draw their maps.
Yes, exactly. And one more really beneficial aspect of proportional representation is we don't have to draw districts based on race or ethnicity anymore to ensure that voters of color can elect their preferred candidates. They just have direct access to the same ballot that everyone else has, and they can vote for who they want and win seats in proportion to their share of the electorate.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's fabulous. And it takes a lot of the venom out of the system, and it makes the racist rhetoric that there is plenty of in America, it gives it no place to go.
Mm-hmm.
I had I talked to somebody yesterday about an idea that will never happen in the United States, but what would its impact? This is a completely hypothetical. Let's say we don't have any elections in the House at all, and there are no districts in the House anywhere in the country, and we pick the members by lottery.
Yeah, that's called the sortition method, and it's some people have been bouncing that around for quite a long time, and it goes back to ancient Greece,
Ancient
where
Athens.
yeah, and in some ways I think that could be beneficial, but in others, it'd be like uh, gambling almost, where sometimes the odds favor you, but sometimes they could elect or they could result in a very bad Congress, and not just in a way of like too many Republicans or too many Democrats, but the people who don't
too
have
many drunks, too many
people, right, the people who don't really have the character or the skills or the desires to do what's best for the country.
Sure. On the other hand, it would mean that all that money we spend in elections would be meaningless. It would go nowhere.
Oh, I think money would still find a way to go somewhere. This is we live in a capitalist society, and moneyed interests are always going to try to affect politics in some way.
Yeah.
And I do think we do need to do something about campaign spending in particular. It's just outrageously high, how high it's gotten in the last 15 years.
Well, I think you mentioned earlier what exactly we have to do. I think you were very clear about this when you said we need Supreme Court reform, because Congress, who knows something about having to run elections, they do every 2 years, in their infinite wisdom, passed bipartisan legislation called McCain-Feingold, Republican Democrat, to rein in money in politics until the Supreme Court said, yeah, no. So you were right. The first step is a Supreme Court that doesn't think it's the one to write the laws.
Yes, absolutely. Every single thing that Democrats might try to do in after 2028, if they win the federal government, everything depends on addressing the Supreme Court first, because as the Supreme Court has shown us, for many years, but especially with their Voting Rights Act decisions and several other cases this year, they're nothing but a bunch of partisan Republicans in robes on the bench, and they will do whatever it takes to prevent Democrats from exercising power and implementing their agenda, so long as they have a majority and believe that the Supreme Court is the supreme branch of government instead of an equal branch of government with a legislature and executive.
And for those of you who are listening, look, I have not talked to Stephen before. I didn't prep him for this. I didn't tell him to say that. I know you heard it from me a bunch, but this is unprompted from somebody else. So on that topic, I mean, you said there are a bunch of Republicans in robes. I don't care what party they are. The nakedness of their contempt for our Constitution and our laws in this Alabama voting rights case this week. I mean, even somebody who doesn't approve of their behavior, like me, was stunned that they would change their mind in the course of, 3 weeks about a decision that just, oh, yeah, no, we didn't mean it 3 weeks ago when we said Milligan is still the law. And so they allowed blacks to be disenfranchised across the South. That is unthinkable in 2026.
Yes, unfortunately, it's one of those decisions that is not surprising, but it is still very shocking to see, because just 3 years ago, the Supreme Court upheld that same Milligan ruling that blocked the Republican map as an intentionally as an intentionally racist gerrymander. And
right. And just 3 weeks ago, Alito said it still stands. And then it came back to them and they said, no, never mind.
Yes, they've essentially they've not just gutted the Voting Rights Act, they have gutted the 15th Amendment to the Constitution and made it practically impossible for even intentional discrimination to result in a map being blocked. Yeah. Yeah. And there's just going to be no limit on Republicans targeting voters of color in redistricting now.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you the same question I ask lots of people, and we'll end with this. But if the Democrats manage to win in the midterms and they manage to get control of the House, and I think that it's not trivial after they win to actually get control. But when they do, what do you think of the House saying, the Voting Rights Act is the law of the land. We don't care what the Supreme Court said, and no one will be seated who is voted in an illegal district?
I sympathize with that in principle, but I think in practice it would be very difficult just because of the way how states run elections, and the House is not a continuing body, which means that after every election, the Speaker's office is vacated, and the first thing the House has to do after convening is elect a new Speaker. And if you don't have that in place yet, it could be very difficult to reject a state's congressional delegation, and that would make it more difficult to challenge these southern maps where states like Tennessee will send an all-white Republican delegation. But on the flip side, it would make it harder for Republicans to try to steal the election by denying seats to Democrats. I think that
they've already done it once with Adelita Grijalva. I wouldn't put it past them.
Well, the thing there is they already had the speaker's office. And, if we get to a situation in January where Democrats have won a majority of the actual seats and Republicans are trying to block them, uh, Mike Johnson will cease being speaker on January 3rd, and they will have to elect a new speaker before they can do anything else.
Yep.
So, I think if Republicans try to
Good
do
point.
this, I think if Republicans try to do this, we are headed towards a very big, political crisis. And I don't see, what the easy way out of that is. But I don't think Republicans will be able to just successfully deny Democrats seats as a way to steal the House after this fall's elections. They
All right,
might think,
Stephen, we're out of time on that optimistic note, but tell everybody how to find your work.
yes, you can find our site, the Downballot, is just the-downballot.com. And that's where we publish our daily newsletter, the Morning Digest, and our other stories like mine on redistricting. And then you can find me on Blue Sky. I'm just at Stephen Wolf. I think it's stephenwolf.bsky.social is the full link.
Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.